The following is a production of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Sponsored by Seedlings Foundation, proud supporter of the Coleman T. Holt Oral History Program.
Welcome to the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's Citizen Soldier. That's made possible in part by the support of Karen Pritzker and Michael Vlock. I'm Robert Jordan.
In the years leading up to the start of the Second World War, amid widespread racial segregation and discrimination in the United States, civil rights leaders launched a campaign for the acceptance of African Americans who wished to enlist and train as military aviators. After more than 2 decades of advocacy, the U.S. Army Air Corps activated its 99th Pursuit Squadron in March 1941, including the men who would go on to train near Tuskegee, Alabama, and become the first black pilots in the history of the American military. Popularly known as the Tuskegee Airmen, and best remembered for the legendary red tails of their P-51 Mustangs, the aviators, navigators, bombardiers, and support personnel of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bomber Group have long been revered for their sterling records of service and for their invaluable contributions toward ending racial inequality in America. By the end of the war, there were more than 15,000 Tuskegee Airmen, including 900 pilots, many of whom risked their lives in combat to defend a nation that wasn't ready to accept or appreciate their service. Among them was a Chicago native, O. Lawton Wilkerson, who earned his wings as a B-25 pilot at Tuskegee and who works to this day to perpetuate the legacy of his fellow trailblazers. Also working to document and preserve this important legacy are scholars like Dr. Daniel Haulman, an historian at Maxwell Air Force Base, charged with preserving the history of the Tuskegee Airmen on behalf of the American people. The subject of many inspirational books and films, the Tuskegee Airmen of World War II should be remembered both as heroes of war and as soldiers for equality, earning more than 150 distinguished flying crosses for their achievements and paving the way for the eventual integration of the United States Armed Forces.
So welcome, gentlemen. It's so good to have you here this evening. And Dan, let's start with you. Can you tell us, give us a short history about the Airmen and how they got started?
Well, I'd be glad to. There were no black pilots in the American military until 1942, when the first black pilots graduated from advanced training at Tuskegee Army Airfield. And they went through several phases of training. They started with primary flight training in biplanes at Moton Field, which is now Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. But that was just the primary training. They later moved to a much larger airfield, Tuskegee Army Airfield, which was several miles to the northwest. At that field, they received their basic flying training in BT-13 aircraft. And then when they went on to advanced training, they divided the pilots between those who would fly single-engine fighter planes. They flew AT-6 aircraft at first to train, and then eventually P-40s. And the ones who were flying twin-engine planes were training in AT-10 aircraft and eventually B-25s. And the pilots who went into the pilot training flew all kinds of planes. In combat, they flew 4 kinds of planes: P-40s, P-39s, P-47s, and P-51s. We hear a lot about the P-51 pilots, the red-tail P-51 pilots, but there were a lot of other planes that Tuskegee Airmen flew before the tails were red and before they were flying P-51s.
Before we get to Wilk, this was a time of segregation. The Army was segregated. And you mentioned that there were no black pilots at that time. So how did this come about? Where was the decision made to begin it at Tuskegee and the selection process for these men?
Well, the decision was really made by the Roosevelt administration, Franklin D. Roosevelt. The War Department, under pressure from the Roosevelt administration, finally decided to establish what became the first black flying unit in history, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, which later became the 99th Fighter Squadron. Eventually, the 332nd Fighter Group was also set up at Tuskegee. The 477th Bombardment Group which Wilk belonged to, was later set up at Selfridge Field, Michigan. But it got pilots from the twin-engine trainees at Tuskegee. So all of the black pilots, whether they flew fighters or bombers, trained at Tuskegee.
So Wilk, you were 18 at the time that you signed up.
Well, actually, I always wanted to fly since being quite young. I used to build model airplanes and all that sort of thing. Get tales to tell about that too. But a friend of mine and I, Louis Siners, were still in our senior year in high school, and we went down to volunteer to get into flight training. Passed the test and were accepted. And within 2 weeks after graduation, we were on the train going south to become a part of that.
Where did you take this test?
Somewhere downtown Chicago, I don't remember anymore.
So was it common knowledge then that Negroes were able then to sign up for flight training?
I think it wasn't common knowledge, but we were interested in aviation, and we pursued the CAP, Civilian Air Patrol, etc., and that's probably where we got the insight into it.
This was your first trip to the South, I understand.
Yes, it was. We were sent to Montgomery on a train, and starting out we had accommodations that allowed a Pullman service. You could sleep overnight in the berths, whatever they Pullman section. And that was nice, first time in that experience, a bit tense. Turns out by the time we got up, we were south of the Mason-Dixon line, and all of that broke down, and we had to go to the coach up next to the coal tender up in the front of the train. And other people went back to the club cars or wherever else they were seated. So that was quite a difference in an experience too.
So that's your first real taste of segregation?
First real hard taste of segregation.
Yeah,
we had
right.
segregation back in Chicago Heights where I was born.
Sure. So you reach Tuskegee, and there you are with all of these other new recruits who are going like you into flight training. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, actually we went to Keesler Field, Alabama first, and did the basic training, just the military training, and then onward to Tuskegee. Somewhere in there we took a test called the Stanine score. It was similar to a IQ test, except that rather than measuring IQ, they supposedly measured who was most apt to be successful as a pilot as opposed to being a gunner or a navigator, etc. And my buddy and I got separated at that point. I went on to Tuskegee and went through the training there.
So Dan, talk to us about these planes that they were flying. I happened to be covering a story when one of these trainers was pulled out of Lake Michigan, and first of all it was encrusted in, now the lake underneath is as the zebra mussels, but as they chipped them off, you could see these planes were really just, it's a big tin can with an engine. I mean, it wasn't much more than that these guys were flying.
Well, especially in the early phases of flying training, the primary phase of flying training, where they were flying biplanes. These were very primitive planes, but there were standard planes for primary training all over the country. And then for basic flying training, the BT-13 was a little bit more advanced, but not much. And it was like a cross between the biplane, except it had one wing instead of two, and the AT-6, the advanced trainer. And the advanced trainer AT-6 was used all over the country, not just at Tuskegee, for the advanced training for the fighter pilots. And for, of course, the bomber pilots, future bomber pilots, flying the twin-engine BT-10s.
So when you finally get a chance to get up in the air, were you a pilot then? What were you selected to do?
Well, I got selected to take pilot training, was sent to Tuskegee, the institute as it was at that time, it's now university. And we trained out of Moulton Field that Dan just mentioned. And my first aircraft was the Stearman, and it was a big airplane. I had an instructor whose name was Charles Johnson. And I recall the first day we went up, we were given an orientation ride. And I thought I knew a little bit about airplanes. And we got up to a safe altitude, a couple thousand feet. And he said, here, the controls are yours, do whatever you'd like to do. The idea being that you were going to sit there and you're going to try to fly the thing straight and level. Well, I had built model airplanes before, and I was very interested in aviation, so I thought I knew what I was doing. And I was going to roll the airplane. And I did roll it. I rolled it upside down, but Johnson wasn't expecting that. And That Stearman, by the way, is a two-seater tandem, and the instructor's behind you, and you see his face in a mirror that's up in front of you. Well, when we got upside down before I could roll it back out, which I really didn't know how to do anyway, he's hanging on because when it went upside down, he hit his seat belt and the safety harness came loose. And he's looking up there and he's cussing me, but I couldn't hear him because the communication had broken loose as well. And I couldn't roll out, and he was unable to really manage the plane, so we did a split S out. That's when you take the aircraft from upside down, pull back on the stick, and it does that. Good thing we had 1,000 feet. So he took me back to the airport, and as we taxied down the line coming back to our parking space, he said, "That guy was trying to kill me." Except guy wasn't the word he used.
Right, right. Well, I guess you figured, well, I can do this now. I've survived this one. I can survive anything, right?
That was just about it. The training went on, and when you mentioned that, the last thing you hear before you solo, and by the way, in the Air Force, you had to learn to fly in 8 hours of instruction. And that
Wow.
may sound like a lot of time, but if you're flying a very light plane, not bad. But if your first plane is a Stearman with a lot of horsepower and a heavier aircraft, 8 hours is not very much. So what they do is they take you out after your 7 or so hours, and the guy finally taxied down to the end of the strip and crawls out of the plane and says, "Okay, fool, go kill yourself."
Now you were in, though, towards the end of the war.
Yes, I came in, my training was finished a couple of months after the war in Europe was over, and they didn't know what to do with us, so I saw a lot of activity after then that had nothing to do with flying. I became, for instance, the lifeguard at the Officers Club at Lockburn Army Air Base, and I couldn't swim worth a nickel.
So Dan, talk to us about the missions that the Red Tails flew. Were they initially as protection for bombers?
No. I might add that when the Tuskegee Airmen, the first black pilots, finished their training, the first class that graduated from their flying training was March of 1942. Reluctantly, the War Department finally let those black pilots fly overseas. The 99th Fighter Squadron at the time, as it was known, deployed to North Africa and then to Sicily and then to Italy, but it wasn't escorting bombers, it was flying P-40s for the 12th Air Force in ground support and flying over convoys in the Mediterranean Sea and supporting troops on the ground. And it wasn't until the 332nd Fighter Group went overseas at the beginning of 1944, it eventually flew bomber escort missions, but not at first. At first it was flying P-39 aircraft. So when the 332nd Fighter Group deployed overseas, it was also flying, like the 99th, missions to support forces on the ground. It wasn't until the spring of 1944 that the 332nd Fighter Group started flying P-47s, which were faster and had longer range. And then in the summer, they started flying P-51 aircraft. The 332nd Fighter Group got the change in assignment. They were going to escort bombers, heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, and they were going to be using the best fighter planes in the Army Air Forces at the time, the P-51.
Talk to us about the end of the war, and you come home, a licensed aviator. What did you want to do?
Well, I wanted to fly, of course, and I had training in multi-engine. It would have been a natural candidate to fly commercially when I got back home. Found out that they not only would not hire me, they wouldn't even take my application. And by the time they did start taking black people, I was too old, so I didn't get to fly commercially when I came back home.
And you had wanted to?
Oh, definitely so. I would also have liked to have stayed in the service. However, I was inducted in the Army of the United States, as it was known, which was temporary in its inception, and when the war was over, they didn't know what to do with us, so eventually they sent us back home.
Now, is that where the name of your club came from? Which, by the way, is what?
The Dodo Chapter.
The Dodo Chapter?
That's right.
After what?
Well, you have to know the legend. Just about everybody knows that the dodo is a bird that can't fly. And when the black pilots came back home, they find, as I did, that they couldn't fly. The dodo became extinct because it couldn't fly. Looked like it was going to be that way for the black pilots who came back home. However, a group decided that it wasn't going to be that way. They're going to put maximum effort in trying to perpetuate the legend, and that they did. They formed the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, and we have a Chicago chapter that, having seen this situation develop, decided they were going to call their chapter the Dodo chapter, because they were going to make sure that the legend was perpetuated.
I know a lot of the Tuskegee Airmen, you know, couldn't fly at the end of World War II, but there were some that did stay in the service and did fly in Korea and Vietnam as well as in World War II. And I might mention two of them as examples. One of them was Charles McGee. Charles McGee's an original Tuskegee Airman who flew fighter missions in Europe during World War II, and then he flew fighter missions in Korea, and then he flew fighter missions in Vietnam, and he flew a total of 409 combat missions, if you add all those missions together. And another is Daniel Chappie James. Chappie James was a member of the 477th like you were, and he wasn't flying in combat in World War II. He was training to fly B-25s for combat, but the war ended before they got to do that. But he went on to fly in Korea and in Vietnam and became the first black four-star general in any of the military services.
As we know, many of the pilots trained right in Lake Michigan off of barges, right off Navy Pier in that area. And I guess they were on aircraft carriers going over, many of them, but the Tuskegee Airmen did not. They trained in Tuskegee, is that correct?
Well, let me qualify that. Not all of the training of the Tuskegee Airmen, flying training, was at Tuskegee. Now, to get their wings, they went through the primary, basic, and advanced flying training, got their wings, became pilots, but they continued to train at other places like Selfridge Field, Michigan, which isn't too far from Detroit. And if you'd allow me, I'd like to say something about the Freeman Field Mutiny.
Sure.
The Selfridge Field is where the 332nd Fighter Group trained before it went overseas. After it left, the 477th Bombardment Group was activated there, and the twin-engine pilots from Tuskegee went to Selfridge to the 477th. The 477th ultimately moved from Selfridge to Godman Field, Kentucky, and then it moved to Freeman Field. And at first, the Tuskegee Airmen who were in the 477th were very excited about being at Freeman Field because it was a much larger field. The problem at Freeman Field was that the commander, Robert Selway, decided to have two officers' clubs, one for whites and one for blacks. He wanted segregated officers' clubs at Freeman Field. And many of the black officers refused to go by that policy, and we know that 101 of them were arrested for that reason, as was brought out. But a question that rose in my mind was, why didn't this problem come up before? Why didn't it come up at Godman Field? So I looked into that a little bit, and I found out why. At Godman Field, there was one officers' club, and the black officers used it. The white officers at Godman Field, and there were white officers with the 477th, used the officers' club at Fort Knox next door. And so that's the reason why the problem didn't surface before that. There was segregation, but it was just kind of disguised. It was Benjamin O. Davis Jr., and I think I need to mention his name, because of all the Tuskegee Airmen, he was the most famous of all. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. went to West Point. He was the son of the first African-American general in the Army. He himself became the first African-American general in the Air Force. He was the commander of the 99th Fighter Squadron. Later, he was the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. And later, he became the commander of the 477th Bombardment Group. And I should say, that's how they eventually settled the Freeman Field controversy. The 477th had been under this racist commander at Freeman Field, and the new commander of the 477th was Benjamin O. Davis.
And how did they finally settle that? How was that resolved?
Benjamin O. Davis Jr. came back from overseas. He had been commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. He was reassigned to be commander of the 477th Bombardment Group, and he replaced Robert Selway. So there was a black commander now in charge of the 477th, and there wouldn't be a problem with separate officers' clubs anymore. As far as the 101 who were arrested, they were eventually exonerated. And so it took them a while to be exonerated, but they ultimately were.
Right. So these were things that you didn't see because you were all at a all-black base. So you didn't really see much segregation in the South then.
There was very little segregation at Tuskegee because Tuskegee was all black. Colonel Parrish was white, but most of the officers under him and everybody who ran the field were black, so there was no segregation there until you went into town. And that was a different story. Tuskegee, the town, is a small place, and they had what was typical of, and probably still is of many small towns, a town square, kind of a grassy area in the middle of the town. And you could be in town and doing whatever you'd like within reason until 10 o'clock at night, at which point you had to be waiting for the bus to go back to the base on a particular corner of this town square. Otherwise, the local cop would come by and pick you up and put you in jail until the military police came to pick you up and take you back to the base. So when you went to town, you felt the discrimination, but not on base. I remember, as I mentioned, you had 8 hours to learn to fly in a fairly hard plane to fly. Went through a lot of training. 2/3 of all the people who attempted that flight training got washed out, sent to other branches of service, and some few home. Finally, you get your wings and your commission. After receiving that, I decided I'm going to go and visit my relatives. And I'm dressed in my full regalia, my wings are shining, I'm a new officer. And I get a ride with some guy who had a nice car on the base, and he took us to Atlanta. And then we dispersed. In order to get out, Chamblee was the name of the place they lived, a little suburb then of a city which is now part of Atlanta. And I had to catch a bus to go out to Chamblee. Stand on the street corner, catch the bus, get on and sit down. And they told me I had to go to the back of the bus. Here I am, a brand new officer with my shiny wings. And I had to go to the back of the bus. I remember that to this day. We've come a long way, but we've still got a way to go.
When exactly, Dan, did the military begin to take these, well, they were baby steps at first, but larger and larger steps toward integrating the military?
That's a good question. The first step was really to have a black flying unit to begin with. At first, the War Department didn't want to let any black men fly. And when the War Department finally agreed to start training black pilots, it was only on a segregated basis. But as time went on, the movement toward integration grew. And one of the leading advocates of the integration of the Army Air Forces and eventually the Air Force was Noel Parrish. He was the white commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield. At first, all of the instructors at Tuskegee were white. And eventually, as the black pilots started coming back from overseas, they replaced the white instructors at Tuskegee Army Airfield. So Noel Parrish was very forward-looking. And when he went at the end of World War II to Air University, he wrote a thesis for, I think it was the Air War College, that advocated the Air Force integrate. Of course, there were pressures all over the country for the integration of the military. There were two struggles. There was the double V campaign, a victory over discrimination at home and a victory over the Nazis overseas and the enemy overseas. But the real success of the integration movement came with Truman, President Truman's issuance of Executive Order 9981 that mandated that all the services become racially integrated. And I say it mandated it, it didn't immediately result in integrated services.
Wow. Well, this has just been fascinating hearing about this part of our history. You brought it back to life. And actually have someone who is living here with us. So, you know, this just makes it all the better. It's so much richer to have you add your own experiences to this. So, thanks so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but to learn more about the topics we've discussed today, please visit the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago or online at pritzkermilitary.org. I would like to thank Dr. Dan Haulman and O. Lawton Wilkerson for sharing their knowledge and experiences with us on this fascinating discussion about the Tuskegee Airmen. On behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, I'm Robert Jordan. Thanks so much for watching.
This program was sponsored by Seedlings Foundation, proud supporter of the Coleman T. Holt Oral History Program, and is a production of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library.